Hey, this is Alan with another tutorial. This one's been requested for a while, and it's the effect of me holding a YouTube video player in my hand the way you see in most episodes. So I'm finally getting into this effect. Let's take a look. Usually the footage I film is something like this. Me holding a green panel and having some markers on it and just miming all the actions and then putting the video on there in post. There are different methods of doing this. This is just one. I've been improving the method gradually over the years, but I've wanted to pick this one from, I think it's an actual take from some video in 2015, where it's not the most modern and seamless way to do it, but it's also not like too primitive. So it gives us what we need, but it's also a little bit challenging because we do have some lighting issues here. It gets kind of dark over here. And the markers themselves, the tracking markers, are not really the ideal way of doing this type of track. You see, they're nice clear circles. They're very easy to see, but you run into an issue when you try to track things that get smaller or bigger when they're circles like this, because they do change shape. And ideally, a marker should be something that gives you like a very specific point, and no matter how far or close the marker itself gets. So these days, I do it slightly differently. Here's a shot from the Beekman episode, and as you can see, it's a similar thing, but the markers are those same circle labels where I just made like an incision vertically and horizontally and peeled away these two opposite slices to make this sort of cross of negative space. And so the good thing about this is you could define this area for the tracker, and no matter how close or far you get, it's always just lines meeting at a center point. So this is a much better way to do it, but we don't have the luxury of that here in this older shot. So I think it's a good learning experience. You can see what kind of issues you run into as you try to track this. And we'll also have to create the thing we put in there as well from scratch. So we got a lot to do. Let's get started. I'll begin with the most tedious part, which is the track. So I like to find in the shot kind of a representative frame. You know, we've got me like no player in the shot. Then I raise it up into frame. I press play. I say something, and I push it forward. I would say that this, just me holding it up here, is kind of like if this had to have a thumbnail, this shot, it would be this, and it happens to be kind of in the middle of the shot, so it's a good place. I'm going to find a spot where I'm not moving it much. And just select my video clip and press star on the number pad to put a little marker on that spot. So we can always find it. If we hold shift and just kind of scroll to it, it's going to snap right to that spot. And any important things that we have to decide visually and you know, set the markers or key the green, we're going to do it from this frame. And then we just have to make sure that everything before it looks good and everything after looks good. So I need something to track to this. So let's create a temporary object that's going to become the contents of the player. I'm just going to press Command Y to create a new solid, and I'll make it bluish or something, some color that is not in the scene so it stands out. And then just once we start putting it into the player and moving it around the scene, I want to have some pattern so I can tell how it's distorting and how it's moving. So let's add something. Let's go to generate checkerboard and create this checkerboard pattern. I'll make it bigger. Let's see the edges. Bigger like this, maybe like this big. And I'll change the blending mode to add, so it goes on top of the blue solid we created. And I'll lower its opacity so it just ends up being this subtle pattern. Now, I'll take the solid itself and pre-compose it, Command-Shift-C, and I'll check Move All Attributes so that this effect and anything else we do with this ends up inside the new composition, and we'll call that composition Player Content. All right, so now it's a composition of its own, and here we can later set up our actual video and animate the interface of the YouTube player and stuff like that. But out here, it's just a video clip now. It doesn't have any effects on it and stuff. So let's just set it aside. Let's turn it off, its visibility off for now. And let's begin our tracking process. So back on our poster frame, or our default frame, I'm going to select our plate shot, and I'm going to turn on the tracker. I'm going to say track motion. And by default, we have just one track point because it's set up by default to track just transformation, just movement in one spot. We're going to change the track type from transform to perspective corner pin. So we have our 4 track points for our 4 markers. I'm going to just quickly move them into place, roughly, and then we'll go through and we'll set them more precisely. So this one goes here. If I select one, I can just scroll my mouse wheel to zoom right into it. I'll set this center point kind of in the center of the circle, and again, this is where that razored marker would be much better because we could tell exactly where that point is, but we could just estimate here, and then we'll drag this inner rectangle, which actually defines the feature that the tracker is going to look for and track. We're going to expand it so it encompasses this circle, and this outer rectangle is as far as it's going to look from frame to frame, you know, where this marker went. We're going to have to keep adjusting this, as you'll see throughout the shot. So this one looks good. Let's do this one. Make it a little bigger like this. Increase this size. Zoom out, select this one, go in. Make it appropriately sized. And the last one. Something like that. So we've defined our markers, but we don't actually want the video to be stretched across the markers. We want it to fill the entire panel. So we're going to have to move this overall rectangle, which represents the exact way that the video is going to be mapped with the corner pin effect. We're going to move it out to the edges, and not just to the edges, but a little bit beyond, so we have this sort of bleed, because in the end, our video is going to be behind the plate, and the green is going to be sort of like a cutout, like a hole in the footage. So we want to make sure that we have a little bit of that bleed so that it doesn't, there's never a gap between the 2 shots, creating nothingness in there. So I do something like this. At the same time, we don't want to make it too big because we have like the player's interface and all of that. We want it to be well in frame, and we don't want to clip away too much of the video that we're showing. So we want to have just enough, but not too much. This should work pretty well. We've set it up now, so we're going to track in one direction and then the other. I think I'll go back first. There's a little bit less to go here. So let's track backwards. Now everything looks good for a while, and then as I press it, that movement's a little bit too extreme for the tracker to keep track of the markers. Especially I see it kind of lose track here. Let's see if I can help it by making this a little bit bigger, and in fact at this point making all the trackers bigger, which will really slow the tracking process down, but it's always a trade-off between how fast you can track and how accurately you can track. So let's see what it can do now. All right, it seems to stay on track. And here it's going to go all the way down to when I'm lowering the player. And I think, let's see. Let's go frame by frame. Yeah, it starts to get to a point where the movement is just too extreme, and at the same time there's a very severe lighting change that happens. So let's see if we can still get it to track. Okay, well, it's having trouble, and since it's so close to the beginning of the shot, we just have a few frames to go. I'm not going to be too fussy, and I'll go ahead and the movement is very fast, so I can just manually adjust these things, and it should work pretty well. Let's go back one. Yeah, now things start to really get crazy, but I'm not gonna I'm not going to keep going back and trying to readjust settings and then having it track. I'm just going to basically do it by hand here. Just because I know there's not that much to do, and I'd rather, you know, here the blur is so extreme. I mean, I might as well just use my own brain to decide. And by the way, when you have this kind of, you know, extreme blurring starts happening, the traditional thing to do is to put it right in the middle, just kind of estimate the exact middle of the blur. I mean, I guess you could do it wherever as long as you do it consistently, but just the visual effects tradition is to put it in the middle. Okay, let's go one more back. All right. This is pretty much turning into tracking by hand. But I think we only have a couple frames to go before we can no longer see the markers at all. And at that point, it doesn't matter. Let's see. Let's raise the exposure of the display here so we could see those things better. Now it's getting so distorted. It's easy to just break the shape, but we're just gonna take it easy and get it close. Something like this. All right. I think that's pretty decent. Okay, one more frame. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing there. So I'm actually going to select my clip here, press U to reveal all these tracking keyframes that it's creating on the fly. And I'm going to erase these ones that we just made with this last one, because there's nothing to be gained here. And let's go ahead and find that frame we started from again. Let's reset our exposure. Let me bring these guys back to a reasonable shape so it doesn't go too slow. And we're going to track forward. Okay, tracking forward now. Now everything's okay, and then when the movement starts to get very fast again, we're losing our tracks right there. So let's go back to where they're still good. I guess this frame here. And I'm going to get these guys to be much bigger once more. Maybe horizontally more than vertically, because I know the movement's happening horizontally. I think I could get these ones to be a little larger as well, just in case. It might seem redundant to keep making them bigger or smaller, but really that little middle part we did without a problem. If we would have had them this big, it would have taken us forever. So it is, even though it doesn't seem so, it's more efficient to keep stopping and adjusting these guys most of the time. Okay, now seems to be all right, but they're losing their grip a little bit. So I'm gonna stop there, and I'm just gonna adjust all of them. Let's see. And I'm going to track back frame by frame to kind of meet somewhere in the middle where they were, you know, there'll be this frame where it jumps from one position to another, but hopefully it's subtle enough that you won't notice. So, okay, let's see. Here it's a little bit weird. Okay. Let's keep going. Now here, once again, I guess it was fine. I'm starting to be a little bit too picky with these guys. Let's track backwards, a couple of frames. Okay. And now that I've stopped in this position, I think it won't be too problematic. I'll shrink these and just go ahead and track forward all the way to the end of the shot. I think we'll be fine. And there we go. we've tracked everything we can track. Just before applying the tracking data, here it's not an issue because we only have our plate and the thing we're going to track onto the plate, the player content. But if you're doing this when you already have a bunch of layers and things happening, you want to make sure to go into Edit Target and check that the thing you want is selected here as the motion target. So I'm going to say OK and say Apply. And now, let me just twirl everything down. If I select my player content and press U, you'll see all these keyframes applied to it. And if we make it visible, we could see what it's doing now. It's kind of moving along with our panel. I'm going to press T and then reduce its opacity a little bit so we could see both things. And then we can kind of check the position of the checkerboard against the markers to kind of check if things are, sticking closely. And it looks okay to me. It's never going to be perfect in this type of track because, we're really corner pin tracking something onto real footage is not an exact science because the camera's lens is creating a little bit of distortion. So these lines are not really straight in the real panel, but our thing is actually straight. So because we have that margin, we can really, just kind of be close enough and create the illusion fairly convincingly. So what do we do next? We had that little bit of trouble at the beginning. I guess we really did track it to the last visible frame, but I think what I'd like to do is to go ahead and just give it, I'm going to press U again to reveal these keyframes. I'm going to create one more frame over here so that when we have motion blur on our video, it has another frame to move from, if that makes sense. In fact, I'll do two. Now, how do I do this manually? You'll notice that the keyframes that were created are for the corner pin effect. So it's a keyframe for each of the four corners, but also a position keyframe. It does this in an interesting way because this whole clip, imagine here it's showing you the dimensions of it undistorted, is actually being moved around. For every frame, it calculated like a median point between the four corners, and it's placing our clip there, but then also doing the corner pin effect based on that position. I think it does that because without the movement, the corner pin effect by itself wouldn't respond to motion blur when we add it. But by moving the entire clip, it's going to be able to have motion blur. So anyway, before we get to the motion blur, let's create those missing frames. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to, and I'm going to move the clip, just estimate where that center point would be. Make sure it's also correct on this middle frame. And then I'll just manually create the keyframes on each one for the corner pin. And the corner pin, once it gets so flat, doesn't have to be precise. It's more important to make sure that we are covering any potential green area of the panel with some footage. So let's just move this. So that's it. After that, we don't really have anything. And the first frame where I'll really make it visible is this. So I'll press Alt left bracket. And before that, although we, if we want it to be really precise, we do see a little bit of it there, but I'm just not going to worry about it. In fact, I should be more worried about this little piece of script I have taped to the back of the panel. That's my little cheat sheet that I was reading by the time I got to this part. So, okay. As you can see, my hand and the panel, when they're moving quickly here, are blurring, but our fake footage is perfectly sharp. So let's give it motion blur simply by pressing F4 over here to switch to the toggle switches on the layer. And this icon is for motion blur, so I'm going to activate it. And I'm also going to turn it on for the composition as a whole. And when I do that, we have motion blur, but it looks weird. It's kind of existing ahead of where it should be. So there's kind of a gap happening. It would be a mistake to fix this by going into the corner pin effect and making an adjustment now in every frame. It would take us forever, and then if we decided not to have motion blur, we'd be out of luck again. So this is a global problem that is fixed globally in the composition settings. So let's go there by pressing Command K and switching to the Advanced tab, where we have a motion blur section. So this kind of treats the motion blur as if we're dealing with a real camera. The way this looks by default in our case is a little bit too much, because I happen to know that this footage is not shot with a 180-degree shutter angle, which is the traditional way to film it. But I actually increased the shutter speed for Captain Disillusion videos because number one, it helps with this kind of thing with motion tracking, and number two, I just like the look it gives. It's a little bit more staccato, kind of cartoonish, sharp look. So on the video camera that I use, which calculates the shutter speed by fraction of a second, instead of being 1/48th of a second for the 24 frames per second speed that we shoot at, it's 1/100th of a second. So that translates to about a 90-degree shutter angle. It's like 86.4 or something like that, but let's just round it off to 90. So when I do that, the blur length becomes more close to what my hand looks like. But we still have a little bit of a misalignment, and we have that gap at the bottom. And we can fix that by shutter phase. It's sort of adjusting what moment in time does the shutter capture. At what point in time does it open and close? So I think maybe 45 puts it, we just have to do this by eye, but it looks to me like 45 puts it right in the middle where we want it to be. So let's say okay and be done with that. Now, even though we added an extra margin here beyond the physical panel in the shot, I think when it gets to situations like this and there's motion blur and there's extreme deformation, we're going to need to have an additional insurance policy. I just want to make sure there's no gap at all at any point. So what I'll do is add another effect called motion tile. We'll add it to our player content, and I'll place it before the corner pin, and it will allow me to kind of extend the margins of the clip even further. I'll do it like 120%, and I'll turn on mirror edges. Right now it doesn't matter, but when we have real footage here, it's just kind of going to smear the edges. And it's not something we're really ever going to see, but just in case some frame over here at the beginning glimpses, stretches the footage so much that it doesn't cover the panel, it's going to help us in that case. Anyway, so here's what we ended up with. Let's preview this. So I think the tracking is complete, and we can set it aside now. Let's go ahead and make this clip. I'm going to press T and raise this all the way to 100% to make it opaque. Let's reset our exposure, and we'll place the player content underneath our plate. And now let's turn our attention to actually replacing this green with nothing so that we can see our player content underneath. Well, we do that obviously by keying, by using some kind of chroma key, but it's not going to be an automatic process because, as I said before, the lighting here is not very friendly and perfect, and it's going to get troublesome when we're over here. But also we have these ginormous markers that are never going to go automatically away. We're going to have to do some manual work to get rid of them, and hopefully it's not going to be too difficult and it's not going to be a frame-by-frame endeavor. So let's see. But let's start simply by pulling some sort of key. I'm going to go ahead and add the trusty old key light effect and select, there's this side of the panel is kind of dark, this side is the brightest, but I'm going to go split the difference and click somewhere in the middle. And it seems to have keyed it out and made it transparent underneath. But it already looks kind of not perfect. So let's quickly switch to our combined matte view. And here we have our black and white representation of what's going to be transparent, which is black, and what's going to be opaque, which is white, and things in between. So it becomes clear what we need to do. We need to get rid of this noise over here, but try to retain this shadow, make sure there's no weird noisy holes in my hand or elsewhere, anywhere else outside of the panel itself. So let's begin. These controls in Keylight are laid out more or less in the order you want to address them, but one that people always skip and that I found very useful is the color itself. Just because you have a color picker and you pick the color doesn't mean you're done with that, because really in footage like this that's really noisy, the color picker is going to pick the one pixel you clicked on, but it could be one of those darker ones or one of the really bright ones or something in between. So we're kind of playing Russian roulette if we just are zoomed out like this and we click it. Let's make sure that what we picked is ideal. So back in the combined matte view, let's just open the color itself and just play with the hue, saturation, and brightness to see if we can get a better result. So I'm gonna shift the hue a little bit and see where I'm at. This is better. And I'm also gonna raise, I guess I can't do it while I'm in this picker, but I'm gonna raise the exposure first to see if I can coax out any of those noisy parts that wouldn't normally be visible. So right now I'm just gonna focus on the panel itself, open that color picker, and go ahead and shift the hue, play with the saturation, maybe maximize the shadow but not have any noise, and brightness. So I guess we're sort of in an optimal place there. Let's say okay, but let's reset exposure and come out. The reason we have all this spill in the jacket is, I guess, because it takes yellow to make green. So I guess in some sort of reverse process, it's picking up on some components of green in the yellow jacket, and it's doing it with this screen balance setting, which tries to, I guess, decontaminate the colors out of whatever it thinks is having green spill on it. So it's really altering the colors. We're not going to worry about that because we're going to handle the actual colors of our resulting picture separately. Right now, we're literally just concerned with this black and white matte being clean. So if I move this screen balance knob, you can see I'm getting rid of this. So I'm going to take it all the way back to where we don't see the jacket, but not so far that it starts to give us too much noise here, right? If I raise the exposure, we could see that sneaky little noise. So I'm going to raise it up just a bit to get rid of that, but not so much that the jacket comes back. And this is my face, I think, which is reasonable because it's literally reflecting the green next to it. But we're going to take care of that, I think, separately. Let's move on to screen matte settings. Now, because, again, the footage, the kind of footage it is and the lighting that we had, it's pretty noisy in the shadow area. So we're going to, there's not that much I can do about it, but I'll try to mitigate it by increasing this screen pre-blur setting. So it kind of blurs things along a little bit. To get rid of this noise, I'm going to clip white a little bit, and also clip black to make sure there's no invisible noise left in the panel itself. And we can decrease the intensity of the shadow a bit, which I think would be good because it's noisy, so we don't want it to be too prominent. Let's take a look as a finished final result. Okay, that's reasonable, I think. We're part of the way there, but there's a bunch of things we need to do. The markers are still there, and let's see what happens when we go all the way down here. Okay, it starts to get crazy and noisy, so we're going to need to fix that a little bit. So let's do that in the next video.